This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 353. Planning for Retirement. Who pays?
How does he look within, giving the grim data of the day?
A smaller than expected increase for consumer prices.
And now inflation is hitting double digits.
You know what? This something for nothing economics isn't conservative, it's socialism.
My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Now, a lot of people are very fearful of what's going to happen when they get old and they can't earn anymore. They'll have to rely on the state pension if they have one, but is it enough? Whereas others have saved quite a lot. In fact, the whole tax system is designed to encourage us to save. But is that a fair system, and is it the best way for the economy to encourage us to save rather than spend? And what happens to that money that we invest in our pensions? When you plan for your retirement, who is really paying the cost? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So there is about £2.5 to £3 trillion of assets in UK private pension schemes. So you would hope that £2.5 to £3 trillion is about the same as the amount that is expected to be paid out from those schemes. Although, as we discovered during the brief Truss premiership, that is not necessarily the case. And thanks to us putting away money like this, we are obviously helping the finance sector grow, which arguably helps the economy grow. So, Steve, the finance sector contributes supposedly 8% of the total economic output in the United Kingdom. Our retirement savings will be a chunk of that. So, isn't that a good thing?
I had a student back in Western Sydney days who put a very nice question because I was raising Minsky's financial instability hypothesis and talking about excessive amounts of debt and too much being paid in interest and so on. And he said, is finance a profit centre or a cost centre? And when you look at manufacturing, you've got something which is a profit centre. You're taking in inputs, you're making goods, you put a markup on the goods, you make a profit out of that. Is finance the same sort of thing? And I think fundamentally no. What it ends up being is a cost centre. It's a cost for business. And the higher the amount of finance as part of your economy, the more you have financial costs inhibiting your other activities, manufacturing and genuine services.
So it's a cost for a business if they borrow. But if somebody is investing,
people are making money out of finance. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. But the thing is it good for an economy to have a financial sector which is larger than another economy's financial sector? And I think
well, the finance sector would say yes, because we are lending more, we are facilitating more growth in our economy. Look at us.
What they're doing is mainly facilitating Ponzi schemes and in unaffordable housing and so on, which is the thing is, look, we've made housing more expensive. Well, okay, what else can you say against yourself? And
we have to create more financial instruments, obviously, because the more. This was what was interesting when we were talking recently. The fact that we were putting money into Bitcoin, for example, is because we need another financial instrument. Because if you've got, and I didn't think about it until this discussion, if you've got so many financial instruments and you've got more money being ploughed into those financial instruments, then you are just going to push up the price of whatever it is that sits behind it.
My overall perspective of this now comes back to the way that
But that's why Bitcoin is just finishing my point. Bitcoin is say, well, we are another financial instrument, so it's somewhere else for money to go. If it didn't go into Bitcoin, then it would go into other assets and just push those prices up.
But the thing is, why are we putting so much of our resources into boosting financial assets? Financial assets are by definition a claim on somebody else. So why are we increasing claims on somebody else rather than, for example, producing more goods, more throughput of goods over time? And I think this is we talk about a financialised economy. That's what we have these days. Finance sector is far, far larger than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, my favourite comparison is actually the UK, because if you look at the UK data, the Bank of England publishes this enormous data series now. It used to be 300 years, and I think it's almost 1,000 years of financial data. And as part of that, they've got the level of private debt in Britain back to at least 1880, I think, and goes. I think the most recent releases go further back back still.
So that's not 1,000 years. Where's the
No,
1,000?
they've got, I think, gold prices back 1,000 years and that sort of thing, but it's varying in time sequences. But the data the last time I used it was back to about 1880. And the level of private debt in the UK never exceeded 70% of GDP from 1880 until 1982. Then it trebled. And this was all when Maggie Thatcher deregulated the housing market so that banks could lend into housing, whereas previously loans for private housing in the UK were largely the province of building societies. Now, building societies, funnily enough, are what economists think banks are. Okay, if you go to a building society, you deposit. For those people too young to remember this particular thing, you deposit your money, and the money would then be put by the building society into its bank account. And if you wanted to withdraw the money, there were time limits. It was a term deposit. It wasn't a demand deposit. And if you did borrow money, the idea was that money which you couldn't get access to was financing the people who were borrowing from the building society to build their homes. Yeah. What that meant was
they're like banks, but with no money creation involved.
But no money creation. Now, what that meant was there was no money creation driving house prices, and therefore house prices were affordable. Now, if you again go back and look at the BIS data, Bank of International Settlements data, and take it back to 1970 or thereabouts, for all the countries which you can find data for, the country with the biggest increase in the price of housing is the UK.
Right.
Now, because by letting banks get in there.
Right. And you're making that point because the size of the finance sector has grown so much. But
that's why it's so big.
But it's grown not necessarily because of people taking out loans, but it's also because people are supposedly saving for their
putting
pension.
money into pensions, etc., etc. Yeah. So, and then what pensions used to be, let's remind everybody here, pensions used to be a state responsibility, paid out on the same, effectively the same per capita rate for everybody of a particular age in that country. And we know much better if we make it based on your income and your investments and your choice of speculative vehicle, blah, blah, blah. And it's grown when we've privatised it. We've taken away from being a state.
Well, it still is state pensions, but I mean the government is spending over $100 billion a year on state pensions in the UK at the moment, which is about 12% of all its expenditure. And of course, we know that's only going to get bigger because we're getting older. We are living
a large part of the privatising of pensions and so on. It's again the same thing applies in Australia, and America's got some sort of scheme as well. But in the main, the pressure's been to get the individual to save for their retirement. That's been the ideology.
Well, yeah, but here you still have that state pension. You don't lose that state pension if you
the state pension would be
more. You're saying
a lot more than
rather than £200, about £200 a week is what you get here. On state pension.
What can you do? You certainly can't afford to rent anywhere within several hundred kilometres of London.
But lots of people do live on that. And then even if you were to say, well, let's make it £400 a week. Yeah. There would still be people who are saying, well, that's not enough for me.
Oh, yeah, but if you look at...
you're always going to have people who want to supplement it.
Pensions, and this is one area where despite making the mistake of creating the euro, the European countries generally had better social security systems. So I can't quote number and verse anymore, but I know that some of the Nordic countries used to have an arrangement that your pension was 70% of your retirement salary. And that is 3 times what people would be facing in the UK. So it meant that if that were what you were going to get, if you were able to live on your working salary, you'd be able to work on your retirement salary because the cost involved in going to work would no longer be there. So the smaller, even though it's proportionally less than your wage income, you'd be as comfortable in retirement as you were in working. And now with the push to state pensions, you can't be comfortable. You've got to be doing something else. And I think that's what's led to a huge part of the Ponzi schemes we're seeing everywhere. People are trying to find a way of buying a non-financial asset, a house or in shares, which will increase in value fast enough to mean they're wealthy during their retirement period. And this is the whole Ponzi scheme.
Right. There's also just, you are heavily incentivised to put money into pensions as well, just for sheer tax evasion. So if you're, or not tax evasion, tax minimisation, I should say.
Yes, use a nice word.
Yeah, sorry. But so if you earn over 100,000 in the UK, and I'm sure this is the same everywhere else, If you earn over 100,000, then you start to lose your tax-free allowance. So that first £12,500 or whatever it is that's tax-free disappears once you get over that level. Now, 100,000 to most people is a lot of money, but it's increasingly becoming not as much as it used to be, and so more people are getting into that bracket, losing that tax-free allowance. So then people go, well, okay, I won't make 100,000 because I'll put more money into pensions, so I don't lose that tax-free allowance. And if you, then there's a whole load of people who are running their own business and paying out dividends. Same thing happens. You get over, you've got to pay. You can pay yourself a salary, then you pay corporate tax on the company's profit, and then you can pay yourself dividends. But if you pay more than 50,000 in dividends, then you go from paying 8.5% in dividend tax to 34%. So you go, okay, well, I won't pay myself more than 50,000. So you get to wherever you go, you hit a ceiling where the government is basically saying, like, if you're paying yourself more than 60 or 70,000 pounds a year, you're going to pay a lot more in tax. So people will naturally say, well, okay, I'll save it, because I don't pay anything on tax if I put it into a pension. And so there's this incentive, the way the tax structure is, to say put money into your pension funds. Yeah. And so that helps the finance sector. No wonder the finance sector is booming.
And like the finance, Eisenhower, people don't often realise the term the military-industrial complex was coined by President General Dwight D. Eisenhower on his, I think, his departure speech from being president. Talked about the growth of a military-industrial complex perverting American industry for the sake of this combination of both the military and the industry that serves it. Well, I think the most dominant one these days is what I call the financial political complex, because if your politicians are lobbied incessantly by people from the finance sector, a lot of the politicians, like Sunak, for example, obviously comes from the finance sector himself, and you have the mindset of the finance sector becomes what dominates how politics is set. So decisions like that about pensions are self-serving stuff for the finance sector. Nobody is saying, do we need more financial engineers? I think what we need is more real engineers. And so what we've got is a massively financialised economy.
Yeah. And if we didn't, if we weren't getting people to put money into private pensions, do we delay the spend? Do we still say, well, okay, out of the money that you're earning, give it to the government, we'll look after it, and we'll pay you a state pension that might be 75% of whatever you're earning now in your old age? That's still money taken out of what you're spending. Or do we say, no, we'll spend that money when we need to, when we get to that stage. In the meantime, we want to encourage you to spend all the money that you have.
Well, I think it's more about what sort of industrial structure do you want for your society. And this, again, if you look back at Maggie Thatcher's ascension, and it really is her political turn that made that huge shift in the UK away from having a focus upon industry to a focus upon finance. The argument was we can do without the manufacturing sector, we'll specialise in services, and services will then be the way that the UK becomes internationally dominant, not manufacturing. Now, the manufacturing sector has duly been trashed, no doubt about that. Mining as well, of course, because a large part of that was shutting down the coal mines. But the finance sector, the only part of it which was really growing, we're not talking extra massages and extra haircuts, etc., etc.
No.
We're talking financial services, and that largely meant creating debt, and that's where the trebling of the level of private debt occurred as part of that. But did that debt finance productive investment, or did it finance a rise in asset prices? And overwhelmingly, the answer is that for finance a rise in asset prices.
And the reason it financed that debt is because if I'm putting a slug of my money that I've earned into the finance sector as my pension fund, then they're going to loan that out to somebody.
Well, they must just loan it. They'll loan it.
They'll buy something with it.
This is where the non-bank financial sector comes in, because mostly what you're talking about with pensions is not banks but non-banks.
Yeah.
And then that gives them a source of revenue, which they then use to buy shares or other financial
bonds,
assets with, and so on. And the banks at the same time, the banks largely are no longer supplying loans to manufacturers, which you have some, okay, there are some business loans, but about 90% of loans go into housing. And then rather than causing houses to increase, it's caused house prices to increase.
Yeah.
And so what you've had is it's a financial bubble.
But if I put my money into a pension fund, that pension fund then uses that money to buy bonds in, not government bonds, but bonds, corporate bonds, which a company is basically issuing its own debt so that it can grow. That's not a bad thing, is it?
That does happen, but let's backtrack quite dramatically to the 1970s in America, and that's when Basil Moore, one of the great post-Keynesian economists, was attacking the whole interpretation of finance that mainstream economics had. And a large part of that was that money is created by the banking sector. Not so the mainstream still believes this nonsense model of the money multiplier, and so what Basil was doing is assembling the empirical data against that model. But a large part of what he was using as example of endogenous money creation is that corporations used to negotiate what they call lines of credit with major banks. So if you had a company like General Electric, it might negotiate a line of credit, meaning effectively like a bank card, for several $1 billion with 30 or so banks. And that meant then once that, if you, let's say they'd renegotiated 100, let's say a 10 billion, a large number, and they'd spent 1 billion of it, they had 9 billion to go. Where if they wanted to spend 9 billion, the banks could not stop them. Okay. Now that's like with a credit card. If you have a credit card and you've got zero balance on it and 10,000 quid maximum, you can go and swipe £9,999 and go and buy yourself a high-end stereo system.
So that's a relationship between them and the bank, basically.
But what that means is that's how banks actually create money.
Yeah.
Now he used the example of lines of credit. They don't exist anymore, largely, because they weren't profitable enough for the banks. They've shut them down. And so what has happened instead is corporation, when they want to raise money for paying wages and supplier costs and so on, they issue what they call commercial paper. So they'll say, here's a note which is the face value of $100, and we'll sell it to you for $98, and that means that when we buy it back from you after 30 days, we've paid you 2% interest. Okay. So the commercial market, so the corporate,
and then longer term though. So for short term cash flow.
Well, what they found themselves forced to do what finance used to do for them.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is the financialization of the economy.
Because then that becomes a financial instrument that gets bought and sold.
And it is an unproductive use of the intelligence of people. I'd rather see engineers designing planes and solar power systems rather than financial engineers designing pension schemes.
There is the benefit though that if I've got money which I want to save for my retirement, if it's used in the meantime to fund business, there's nothing wrong with that.
It doesn't fund business. It funds a speculative bubble. Okay, the vast majority of the money is going into the housing sector and going into asset purchases. It's not going to. If you're old, you may be old enough to remember in English.
I think you keep on forgetting how young I am, Steve. I think you assume that I'm the same age as you, when in fact I'm much younger, incredibly younger.
Okay. Well, if you're not old enough to remember a show they called The Plane Makers. You ever see that one?
No.
It was brilliant. You're complaining about a Brit show about Brits in Australia before we started recording this. Go and look up The Plane Makers. And that was a show about a British company making planes. Now, that wasn't a Monty Python series. It was actually a genuine series. You used to make aeroplanes here. Instead, you financial engineer. Your flights are the flights of the asset prices, not the flights of the Concorde.
And I guess the problem is that all of this is being counted as part of our GDP, isn't it? Which just demonstrates what a nonsense measure it is. So if I had if I put £50,000 aside, I mean, I could do one of two things with it, couldn't I? I could spend that 50,000 in the economy, and then you do get the economic multiplier. In that £50,000 gets spent on things that then pays people, and they have money which they then spend, so that's another 50,000, and so it goes on, and so we get the velocity of money kicking in. If I spend that 50,000 and I put it into the financial sector,
then it slows down.
It slows down, but it's still counted as part of GDP.
And that's the problem.
Even though nothing's really.
If you go back and look at where national accounts came from, Copeland in the United States was mainly responsible for designing the national income and NEPA, the National Income and Production Accounts, I think they're called. And the question came, how do you actually measure the finance sector? And like with the industrial, I mean, you measure the goods that are sold, the actual value of commodities going out the door, and commodity production per year was how you measured the industrial side of the economy. Well, there was nothing being produced by the finance sector. So the simple shortcut was say, let's add up the wages and profits. Okay. Now, that's adding up your costs, not adding up your profits fundamentally. But it's treating those as on the same score as profits from a sale of manufactured items. So it aggrandizes the finance sector. The more it costs, the better it is. But if that's the cost of getting business done, then you're saying, oh, it's great. It's now more expensive to make stuff here. That's a real improvement. And then at the same time, if you say, well, let's not make stuff. Let's just make things more expensive. Let's have more expensive houses and more expensive shares, et cetera. That's what it's ended up doing. It hasn't been a productive issue at all. And I want to see a decline in the financialisation. That'd be a good thing for everybody except the finance sector. And
things being more
tears over the finance sector after lunch.
Things being more expensive are okay if people have got more money, of course, isn't it?
Which they haven't.
Yeah.
All the complaints are coming from.
Yeah.
So it has been, it's part of why Britain in particular has become impoverished over the last 40 years. We had people who said, look, trust us, we're neoliberals, we know what we're doing. We will make the economy work better. We'll privatise this rather than public stuff. Things work better in this private sector, so you'll get much better trains here. In 40 years' time, you'll hop on a train in the UK and you'll find it's got this swish high-speed stuff and gets you around really quickly and it's really cheap. And those poor Continentals with their publicly owned system will have run-down trains and...
You'll have the TGV going to the south of France at only 150 miles an hour or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's right. You and I need to do a show where we do the forecast of neoliberalism and what actually happened. And it's a completely different world.
Right. So in this completely different world where I'm not putting money into a pension scheme and we have less of a financialised economy.
You might have more of an investment one.
Yeah, okay. We'll look at what that looks like when we come back in just a second on the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. We are back very, very soon.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So we are looking at retirement on the Debunking Economics podcast this week. And is it necessary for us to save for retirement, or should it all be provided by the state? And when we do save, what happens to it? It just adds to the financialisation of the economy. But so, Steve, if we weren't doing this, I mean, you're always going to have people who want to save, obviously. But just imagine if everyone was very happy with the state pension. It was so extraordinarily large. We all felt very confident that we were going to be able to live our latter years in an enormous amount of comfort. What would happen? I mean, and you've described the situation where banks would be loaning out to companies. If companies wanted to grow or they needed cash, either for cash flow purposes or for capital investment, they go to banks, and banks would invest, and that would be, that's the way it would operate. So we wouldn't have these bits of paper, these bonds that are being issued that are then treated as financial instruments. So the finance sector would be a lot smaller than it was.
Yep.
But if I wanted to save, well, first of all, if I'm not saving because I'm happy about what I'm going to get from my retirement, I'd have a lot more cash swilling around. What am I going to do with that? I'm only going to spend it. And that's going to push prices up, isn't it?
Well, not going to
maybe not houses.
Not asset prices. I mean,
but everything else. So I'd have more money left because asset prices haven't gone up. So the price of a Mars bar would treble, for example.
No, it wouldn't. Maybe the quantity of Mars bars might treble, which actually probably worse than the price rising.
So we'll consume more.
We would be consuming more. We'd actually
be a problem in itself.
Well, this is with the situation we're approaching with climate change. Yes, that is a huge problem. But the thing is, we would have the industrial skills that are necessary to convert from what we're doing to what we need to do to survive climate change. Now, one of the reasons why I'm pessimistic about our future in general is that we've got the wrong sorts of engineers. We have people who are happy to design financial instruments who have no idea of how to design a vehicle or a power unit or anything at all physical, and yet we're going to need those physical skills drastically to cope with the change from a fossil fuel economy to whatever comes after.
So we'd have more cash because we're not putting it into our pension. We'd have more cash today to spend on climate change mitigation.
We'd have more capable engineers than we have right now. What we've ended up with is a bunch of is it wankers or bankers? I keep forgetting which.
Don't worry. We don't know it to death. Okay. Come on.
Who are into designing financial instruments and and taking a slice off the gain in the
right,
asset
but those people will all be unemployed. So let's worry about the rest of us. We've got all this extra cash now that we're not investing into the finance system, assuming we're all going to earn the same amount of money. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll start earning less because we don't need as much money to invest. What happens then? Where does all this extra cash go? What do we do with it?
Well, it just ends up going into the physical economy rather than the financial system, and this is the problem that we always have with the banking sector, and Richard Vague's work highlights this beautifully. They are always going to go into bubbles. Whatever bubble is like. Richard's experience began with the oil bubble, and after the quadrupling of oil prices in '79, and every bank in Texas was lending to a oil rig, and then the oil price collapsed, so they all went bankrupt, and then that's where Richard's success in the consumer lending occurred. And he just said, "This is if you're a banker and you're not investing in the current bubble, you're the outsider at all the social gatherings." So what we get out of a system driven by finance is bubbles. Herd behaviour and
stagnation.
Also,
how much of the slow growth
that
we're seeing?
Part of the stagnation
because we've barely got over 2% for well over a decade in terms of GDP growth in the UK, and it's the same in many other parts of the Western world as well, isn't it? So if we got over this financialisation stage, GDP would pick up, the growth rate would pick up.
Well, also we could have been investing in solar technology and wind technology and nuclear technology 50 years ago versus what we've done instead.
But I'm not going to do that as an individual with the extra cash that I've got available, though. Someone would be trying to sell me bonds, which you get back to the financialisation of the industry.
Well, the bonds have only done it because they let the finance sector take over. Right. I mean, the whole fact that you have individuals supposed to be considering which share investments to make for their retirement portfolio is nonsense.
No, but again, it gets back to, so if I've got that spare cash, how do I help with the funding of wind farms?
Because you'll be buying them.
Right.
Okay.
From who?
From manufacturers who would exist.
Right.
Who are not for the
And by issuing me shares?
No, by buying products off them. Come on, you're trying to tie me in knots.
Because I can see that the financialisation is going to creep back in again.
You have to try to keep a lid on it, and this is why, one of my favourite phrases from Marx is the roving cavaliers of credit. And he was quite aware of the extent to which the finance sector can take over the physical economy. And he said at one stage, and these, I don't think he used the word morons, but it was something similar. These morons know nothing about production and should have nothing to do with it. Okay. Now, he was quite right in 1870. It's the truth in 1970. It's the truth in 2020. The finance sector knows bugger all about how to get manufacturing done and should get the hell out of the way and just be a service point for the needs of the actual physical economy, not dominate it, not run it. We've let it run it, and what it means is we've had financial bubbles galore. We've reduced the rate of growth of the physical economy rather than increased it. And when we will need a drastic change in the direction of the physical economy, we won't have the skill sets necessary to enable that.
So when we get to the stage where we all want to retire on our 2/3 of what we've been earning all of our life and have a comfortable old age, where does that money come from? Because obviously the idea that it would be for conventional thinking, it would be abhorrent, the idea that a generation would say, oh, well, we're not going to save anymore. We'll be paid for by the next generation.
It's not the amount you save, it's the amount of physical resources and productivity you have at the time and whether you can devote that to people who aren't working. That's the real issue. So you need the physical resources, not the financial at the time. The financial is going to be buying goods and services, and if you're not producing the goods and services, then it's worthless. So when I'm 85, who's paying? How am I getting paid?
The
people below 85 who are still working should be. We should as
but that is what I'm saying. That is where it's a very difficult political argument, that, isn't it? Because to have people saying, "Hang on a second, now you could have saved all through your life to pay for your retirement."
And this is making the mistake of believing saving creates money. Okay, it doesn't. Okay, banks create money, governments create money, and the government creating money could be used to say we're going to reserve a certain fraction of our resources for people who are no longer young enough to work, and that should be something we can all say. Okay, when I can't work in the future, the state or the society in general will make sure that I can still have a decent standard of living. Now, instead, we've completely taken that away and said it's up to you, and also the way the pensions are determined, the wealthier you are, the more pension you have. That doesn't help you if you're a low-income worker. You end up, you live in poverty while you're working, you have poverty when you retire. It's a huge part of where the dissatisfaction with this society has come from.
So, and it becomes an intergenerational issue as well, of course, because most people who get a healthy pension still have it when they die, and it gets passed on. So, and we'll talk about intergenerational wealth in a subsequent episode. But I mean, it's a big contributor to it, of course, isn't it? But it's just this idea that funding everybody from today's money would mean a lot more. Well, either a lot more tax or an acceptance that governments can go into debt. We haven't won that argument in society
yet. Never going to win
yet.
it, and it's as frustrating as hell for me because I see this nonsense being pumped out by conventional economists like Mankiw and Blanchard, and they just completely misunderstand the monetary system, and that's a huge part of why we've ended up in this mess to begin with. And
And there's also the question, because it's not just old age, is it? I mean, there's a lot of people who depend on welfare as well. We just look after pensioners a little bit more because we've, you know, in the UK, we've triple locked. So we basically said, well, it's either your pension is going to go up by CPI, or it's going to go up by 2.5%, or it's going to go by whatever the rise in average earnings, whichever is the largest. So we do look after old people. I mean, most people won't have enough to live off on a state pension alone. But we do look after them more than we do, for example, young people or the working poor, for example, people who are, forcing themselves to go to food banks to get fed.
I know, and this is one thing I find difficult about travelling between London and other cities. The level of homelessness here is just striking compared to virtually any other city I've been to, including even Bangkok for that matter. So the extent to which poverty is forced upon people, or people find themselves in a poverty trap and can't get out, is appalling. And the whole focus on how are you going to pay for it is a large part of why that situation has occurred.
So how do we manage this then? How do we develop a system where there's less financialisation going on because less of us are putting money into the finance system to supposedly save for our pensions? Do we do it with tax? Do we say, well, you can if you want, but we're not going to give you a tax dodge of any sort?
I think it's because the power of the banking sector to create money and the political power that comes out of that as well is huge. So you have to constrain it. You have to put it in a box. And the box would say you can only, for start becoming a bank, is actually a state privilege. You have to get a state registration to become capable of creating money. With that privilege should come responsibilities. Okay? We should limit what banks can lend to. And I've argued this for decades now, that banks should not be allowed to lend more than, say, 10 times the annual rental income of a property for the purchase of a property, and that could potentially eliminate the housing bubble.
So that's an answer to how do we stop the growth of financialisation in the economy, but also to stop me putting my money into the finance sector because I'm saving for. So it's a tax dodge. Well, not a tax dodge, but I mean, there's a lot of tax incentives for you to save for your retirement now. If we were to say, well, we want to stop that happening because too much of that money going into the finance sector is just making the situation worse. It's putting money into these instruments that are created, which helps perpetuate the finance sector. Do we stop that by saying, well, number one, it's no longer tax deductible? Is that the first step? You can save if you want, but it's in after-tax dollars, so you might as well, or after-tax pounds, so you might as well spend it on your day-to-day living rather than pushing it.
Well, that's partly where corporations have got caught up in this because they get tax deduction for interest but not tax deductions for dividends. So it actually biases them in favour of debt financing rather than equity financing, and it's why they'll do share buybacks. So there are all elements about the taxing system which get in the way. But I think a lot of it just fundamentally comes down to understanding how the banking system actually operates, that it actually creates money. It's not pooling savings. It doesn't need your savings. It actually creates them by creating debt on one side and deposits on the other. But you want that debt to be, if you're going to create debt, you want it to be something which is going to enable more productive resources in the future. And a more expensive house does not produce more children, so far as I've seen.
No.
Well, because maybe Moggs is an exception there. Rees-Mogg. Is that his name?
Yeah, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
That'll do. Yeah.
Just the very idea of having children.
When make his house, he might have twice as many kids. You never know. But in general, you're not producing anything out of making houses more expensive.
Yeah.
But that's been largely that's if you want to say what's been the benefit of deregulating the finance sector, it's more expensive housing and less manufacturing, and that's hardly what I call a productive economy.
So how did it work in the olden days then when it comes to just focusing on pensions now? So I look at my old mum. She's got a state pension, and then she's got a pension left over from my dad working for ICI. So companies used to supplement pensions as an incentive for you to work for that company. Of course, they held the liability for those pensions as well, so you didn't get that money if the company goes against the wall, which we've seen from time to time. But is that a better way? So you are
something
saying...
of that nature. I mean, when you think about pensions are largely necessary for people who are not wealthy. Okay, so you're working class, your middle class, lower middle class, that's the part of the society which is going to depend upon a pension. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're a wealthy capitalist and so on, you're never going to need it. And so...
Well, you're going to need cash flow from something, but from the
use
companies
it as a tax dodge, not as a necessary source of income.
Yeah.
So you really, when you're trying to reduce pensions, you're trying to reduce the extent to which the state takes care of the poor, and that is that is a recipe for social breakdown over time. There's a reason to say some people, factory workers, workers in fast food restaurants, etc. If you're not going to make a fortune, okay, but you're going to make enough to stay alive, and when you can no longer work, we're going to also make sure you can stay alive. That's the level that gets the pensions. Now, when you put the pressure on reducing pensions and say it's what you save and your financial investments and so on, you're ignoring that part of society. When that part of society is 5% or so, that's survivable. When it's hitting 30%, and I think that's quite a reasonable estimate for the UK, if not higher, then you've got a society which is going to fragment. And that the ignorance about the need to maintain a decent living standard for the whole of society, because a huge part of the problems that countries like the UK find themselves in today.
But the idea, and the Labour Party in the UK, and I think this happens quite a bit in that socialist country, Germany, West Germany, the idea that you give workers a shareholding within the business. And that shareholding, you'd hope, would go up in value. But at least they've accrued something. That is almost like a state pension in a way, isn't it? It's giving them an asset. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's partly that reflects the different industrial structure of Germany. I mean, Germany, I don't know whether this still applies, but when I learned about Germany at my university days, German companies had two boards. They had the normal corporate board and what they called the Aufsichtsrat, I think it was, which is an oversight board that has workers on it and customers and local residents and so on. So what you were doing was getting a community feed into the company and community engagement with the company as well coming out of that. And I think that's probably the reason why Germany is still an industrial power. It seems to be losing its grip at the moment, but it hung it a lot longer than the UK did.
It does seem a healthier system, doesn't it, where you say, well, okay, the government's going to look after you to a degree that you can live on reasonably comfortably till you die, till the day that you die, and without carrying over wealth for the next generation. We'll just keep on paying till you die. And then if you want to supplement it, choose carefully. And there'll be employers out there who are saying, well, look, we'll look after you. We'll give you a good pension scheme, or we'll give you a share scheme. We'll contribute to supplement it. Because then the company is doing that work rather than the finance sector. That sounds like...
that's a bit healthier. I'd rather see the industrial sector in charge than the financial sector.
Yeah. And then it is, so to get to that stage, it's really just a question of tax, isn't it? Tax incentives for savings.
No. It's a question of the politics of your culture. And starting off by saying, we want to ensure that anybody who's in our culture, in our society, can live comfortably from birth to death. We don't want people ending up in homelessness and poverty when we need their input to society. I'm getting a bit inarticulate here, but I find it debilitating the extent to which we're going to have money in tax, rather than saying our first priority is a standard of living, and then we ensure that we
figure out how we get there.
Yeah. And we're not doing it. Okay, we've thought the market would get us there, and what we ended up is Ponzi schemes and bubbles and crashes instead.
Right. Well, next time we're going to talk about the price of energy. And are we paying enough? And what would happen if we really did pay the true price of energy?
I'm going to be even more depressing on that than I was on this one.
Well, I thought we had some positive outlook today. I thought, comparatively speaking. Anyway, we'll do that next week. Good to talk, Steve.
Okay, mate. Good.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.